Good afternoon, everyone. Hopefully the first 2 weeks of remote teaching and learning have gone smoothly for you. This will be our third week, and we'll be beginning, I guess, week 10 in the syllabus. Uh, John Rawls' theory. So let's go ahead and jump right in. I'm going to spend a little bit of time doing some background on both what we mean when we talk about distributive justice and political theory and philosophy, as well as some background on Rawls himself. Then we're going to turn to looking at Rawls' two principles of justice and thinking about what some of the implications and critiques of Rawls' theory might be. Now, this is going to be an incredibly simplified and schematic form of Rawls' theory. Theory of justice is about 500, I think close to 600 pages. You read but a fraction of that, and we'll be really focusing on getting the main ideas here. But if you're interested in Rawls' thought more generally, please chat with me in office hours or send me an email. I'm happy to point you in directions for you to learn more if that's something that's interesting to you. So, what do we mean when we talk about justice? What is it that this word refers to? Well, we might start by looking in the dictionary, where Merriam-Webster describes it as the quality of being just, impartial, or fair. Of course, the operative word here is the word just, right? Which the dictionary then defines as being or acting or being in conformity, which is what is morally upright or good. So it's not particularly helpful looking at the dictionary. If you're familiar with the TV show The Good Place, you might be familiar with Thomas Scanlon's definition of justice, what we owe to each other, that justice are the obligations and duties that we owe to other human beings. Political philosopher Michael Sandel gives us a helpful way to think about justice in his book titled Justice. And he writes, to ask whether a society is just is to ask about how it distributes the things we prize, income and wealth, duties and rights, powers and opportunities, offices and honors. A just society distributes these goods in the right way. It gives each person his or her due. The hard question begins when we ask what the people are due and why. And this is really what, when political philosophers and political theorists talk about justice, they're often talking about. They're talking about how a society distributes the things that matter in that society, how are wealth and social privileges distributed, how are rights and duties distributed, and is every person given the things that they are entitled to? Does everyone have what they are due? This idea that each person should be given what he or she or they are deserve. Now, Sandel is right here. The hard question isn't so much saying what justice is, but determining what this fair share is. What are people due? What is the right? What does it actually mean to be just? Um, so we can break this down a little bit more schematically here. That on the one hand, the justice really can refer to two different things. On the one hand, we can look at justice in terms of distributive justice. Does everyone have their fair share in society? And we can break this down more concretely into two different ways of thinking about distributive justice. On the one hand, we can look at substantive theories over here, and these are theories that tell us what a fair distribution looks like at the end of the day. So this could be something like a Marxist theory that there should be no private property and everyone should have equal entitlements. This could be a theory that's a bit more flexible that says everyone should be given an equal or enough resources so that they can live a full and fulfilling life. But they're going to say that they're going to give some account of what a just distribution looks like. Now, in contrast, are what are known as procedural theories. And these are theories that don't give us what the right answer is, but they say that we should determine what a fair way to distribute these resources are. And once we determine a fair procedure, whatever outcomes we get from that procedure is going to be just. So these are less about telling us what justice is, but how we would get to a just distribution. Now, we often also think about justice in this other sense of corrective justice. This is when we're talking about moral responsibility. What am I responsible for? This is also when we talk about things like the criminal justice system, criminal law. We'll talk about this a little bit in the last week of class when we talk about responsibility. But again, these theories can be broken down into a few main theories here. On the one hand, we can have distributive theories of corrective justice, and these are theories that are going to focus on, these are theories that focus on the idea that human beings deserve to be punished when they commit some sort of injustice, when they act in wrong. There are also that say why we punish people who do wrong are in order to have better consequences, such as deterring crime or reforming people or restoring order. But then we also have restorative justice theories. Now, some of you may have taken classes on restorative justice here at Oxy, and these are much more about repairing this injustice, this breach in the social contract by integrating people together. So for our purposes, we're going to be focusing on the question of distributive justice. So we're going to be asking questions like, how should the benefits and burdens of society be distributed? Do fair and equitable procedures guarantee just outcomes? That is, does procedural justice actually lead to substantive justice? How should we evaluate the justice of social structures like race, gender, class, colonialism? And to answer this, and how should we respond to injustice? What are our obligations or responsibilities in light of injustice? And that's going to transition us to the last unit of the course when we talk about responsibility. We're going to look at both liberal theories of justice. That's this week's topic. Today we're looking at John Rawls's more left-leaning liberal theories, and on Wednesday we'll look at Friedrich Hayek's right-leaning theories of justice. But we're also going to be looking at critiques of these liberal theories from the perspective of critical race theory with Charles Mills, from the perspective of feminist theory with Carol Pateman, and the perspective of class with you looking at the Communist Manifesto. So thinking about how these liberal theories of justice don't allow for us to think about racial, gender, or class-based injustice as structures of injustice. So that's a little bit of a preview for the next 2 weeks. Now let's talk a little bit about John Rawls. John Rawls was a 20th century political philosopher. He's largely credited with revitalizing the field of political theory in the United States in the 1960s and 70s and 80s. He was born in Baltimore and studied religion at Princeton. He originally intended to go into the seminary and wrote a senior thesis at Princeton on sin and faith. He then served in the Pacific Theater of World War II and was awarded the Bronze Star. And he wrote that he actually lost his faith because of the horrors that he saw during the war. And after the atomic bombing of Hiroshima, he became disillusioned with military service as a whole, and he refused to discipline another soldier and was eventually demoted before he was discharged. He eventually returned to the academy to study political and moral philosophy, but he said that he had always been interested in moral questions and the religious and philosophical basis on which they may be answered. And so he says that he spent 3 years in the U.S. Army, led him to be more concerned with political questions. He started writing a book on justice in 1950, which would eventually be published in 1971 as a theory of justice. So he took 20 years to write and publish this book. But in so doing, he pretty much redefined the course of political philosophy in the North American world. After World War II, there was a sense that political philosophy was dead, that the horrors of World War II, of fascism and totalitarianism, this created a general skepticism about political theory, that we could build these grand political theories in the sense of like Hobbes's Leviathan, or a Marxist revolution, or a Platonic just city. And so things shifted much more towards empirical political science, or to political theory as a historical inquiry, more along the lines of what we've been doing in this class. Rawls fundamentally reorganized the way we think about political philosophy, as the political theorist at Harvard, Katrina Forrester, argued in a book that was published in 2019. That the Rawls basically redefined what political philosophy is, and everyone in the kind of writing after Rawls has been responding in some way to Rawls's influence. So a theory of justice, which we've read excerpts from today, provides a social contract model, kind of in the line of Hobbes and Locke, but that gives us a model of justice based on a conception of fairness. In 1993, he published a book called Political Liberalism, and in this book he wanted to answer the question of, given that we have reasonable disagreements in a liberal society about what the good life is, right? Because we have different moral and cultural and religious beliefs, how do we make politics legitimate if we don't have something like an Alfarabian supreme leader who is inspired by divine revelation, or Plato have legitimate political societies? And then in 2002, before he died, the last book he published before he died, The Law of Peoples, he tried to answer the question of what principles of justice should govern politics between nations, moving from the question of domestic justice in a theory of justice and political liberalism to global or international justice and law of peoples. So before we turn to Rawls's theory, if you need to take a break, pause this video. Now would be a good time for that. In a second, we're going to start talking about Rawls's theory of justice as fairness as presented in A Theory of Justice. So Rawls begins on page 3 of your reading of A Theory of Justice, and he says that justice is the first virtue of social institutions. Now, he's not making an empirical claim. I'm sure that we could all look around the world and see social institutions that we would not describe as just. But what he's saying is that all social institutions aim for some principle of justice. They might not always realize them or fulfill them, but when we are evaluating social institutions, the first thing that we are evaluating is if they are just. And what does he mean by this? He's saying that he says on page 7, that the primary subject of justice is the basic structure of society, or how social institutions distribute fundamental rights and duties and determine the division of advantages and disadvantages from social cooperation. That he fundamentally thinks of society as a cooperative venture for mutual advantage that is both marked by conflict and an identity of interests. And the basic structure of that society is how that cooperative venture is organized, right? How are rights and duties organized? How are the advantages and disadvantages, or the burdens and benefits of social cooperation, distributed to those members of that society? And so he's trying to think about, like, what are the principles by which, or the rules that would govern a just society? And he says quite explicitly that he's operating with respect to the social contract tradition. And so he's looking for principles that free and rational persons concerned to further their own interests would accept in an initial position of equality. And you can think of this kind of like a Hobbesian or Lockean state of nature here, that what he's trying to do is rather than building a society from scratch, what would be the principles that in a state of nature, a state of perfect freedom and perfect equality? What principles would rational people use to govern that society? And so you can think of the original position and Rawls's whole project here as a kind of social contract, that he's trying to figure out what would individuals who, despite their different backgrounds, who were free, rational, and equal, how would they choose to organize a society? What principles would they use to guide their social engineering? So Rawls begins with the goal to develop a conception of justice that nullifies the accidents of natural endowments and the contingencies of social circumstances. So he thinks that what we're trying to do is to ignore from our conception of justice natural endowments. So this is everything from the particular body that we inhabit, our brain chemistry, whether or not we have physical or learning questions of ability, everything from how tall we are, everything from any chronic illnesses that we do or do not have. All of these things about our bodies and minds are kind of given as nature. But we also want to avoid biasing our conception of justice based on the contingencies of social circumstances. how wealthy our family was, what level of education do we have, what kind of culture we're born into, our religion. All of these things, both natural and social, and as a caveat, there's a huge conversation to be had about whether anything is really a natural endowment, right? Even something like chronic illness or brain chemistry, these only become salient because we've structured the social world in a particular way, but that's a broader discussion. Um, tendencies. What he was trying to say is, how do we have a theory of justice that ignores the accidents of birth, the things that we don't have any control of? And why is he approaching it from this way? Because he's basically concerned that we end up justifying lots of unjust things in our world because we are biased from these natural endowments and social contingencies. That we end up basing some sort of existing inequality and saying that we deserve it, right? We might think that we deserve what to be at Occidental College, but if you think about it, so much of your ability to be at Occidental College are based on things that you have had no sort of moral claim over. You didn't choose the mind or body that you were endowed with. You didn't choose the educational or an income status of your parents, which, based on pretty much resounding social scientific evidence, is a huge predictor of how the type of educational achievement that you'll attain. You absolutely worked hard to get here, but you were also endowed with particular minds and particular social spheres that enabled and empowered you to do that hard work and to get here. And so we risk justifying inequalities by saying, oh, well, I deserve this excessive wealth or income, or I deserve this extra special treatment because I worked hard, or I deserve it, or it's based on my merit. And so what he's saying is that because we don't earn or deserve our natural endowments or social circumstances of our birth, which shift a significant proportion of our life outcomes, that we should treat these things as arbitrary. And therefore, when we're talking about justice, we shouldn't bias our conceptions of justice based on these things that are morally arbitrary. That a conception of justice should nullify these things that create unjust and immoral inequalities. That we need a system of justice that people would agree on and would avoid these biases of morally arbitrary circumstances. And so he does try to achieve this through the thought experiment of with the idea of the original position and the thought experiment of the veil of ignorance. That we need to move from the biased conceptions of justice based on merit or desert to an original position of equality, where we can choose principles of justice without being biased. So he imagines us behind a veil of ignorance, where we only know that we have a life plan, right? That we will have some sort of goals and desires and hopes and ambitions, that we are rational and self-interested, and rational in the sense that we are going to maximize our own well-being and try to, take care of ourselves. We know certain general facts about human society, and he includes like the basic principles of economics, sociology, and psychology, as if that these general facts are not contested, but that's a whole other thing. But we don't know most things. We don't know what our life plans or goals will be. We don't know if our goal is to write the great American novel or to be a track star. We don't know what our race, gender, class will be. We don't know what our sexual orientation or brain chemistry will be. We don't know if we'll have chronic illnesses or not. We won't know what religion we'll have. We don't know what social skills, what knowledge we'll have, what level of education we'll have, what particular talents we might have. We won't know our level of education. We won't know our job. We won't know our profession or calling, our religion or culture. We won't know what we do for leisure. And we won't know how the society is organized. And Rawls thinks that he's accomplishing two things here. By excluding all of these unknowns, that first we will be able to avoid these biases, as he writes on page 139. No one will be able to tailor society to their own advantage, but will also come to a unanimous consent. He writes on 139, it's clear that since the differences among the party are unknown to them, and everyone is equally rational and similarly situated, each is convinced by the same arguments. So the principles that we'll choose behind the veil of ignorance will choose unanimously. So what principles would we choose? How would we distribute society's rights, duties, and social and economic goods? Well, the first principle is pretty straightforward. And if we're talking about the basic rights and liberties in a society, that we want to make sure that every person has an equal right to the most extensive, basic liberty compatible with a similar liberty for others. So when we're talking about political liberty, freedom of speech and assembly, liberty of conscience, freedom of thought, freedom of person, along with the right to hold property, these are these are not going to be these are going to be distributed equally without regard to any morally arbitrary contingencies. So you cannot have any sort of restrictions of civil liberties based on race, gender, sexual orientation or identity, religion, culture, ethnicity, ability, health status, marital status, anything like that. So like everyone, if there's a right to vote, everyone has the right to vote. If there's a right to hold property, everyone has the right to hold property. Everyone has the freedom of speech and assembly. Everyone has freedom of conscience and freedom of thought. All of these basic fundamental rights are going to be guaranteed to everyone. Now, the challenge comes when we think about how social and economic resources should be arranged, because a society isn't just basic rights. As Rawls's conception of a society is that it is a cooperative venture for the sake of mutual advantage. So how are these mutual advantages going to be distributed, since not everyone is going to win all the time? And so we probably will begin, we have this intuition that we all share that, well, if we're going to have resources, that they should be distributed, and they have to be distributed, they should be distributed in a way that benefits everyone. And so he gives us a provisional form of the second principle, that social and economic inequalities are to be arranged so that they both A, reasonably are expected to be to everyone's advantage, and B, attached to positions and offices open to all. That everyone will benefit from the distribution of social and economic resources, and that they are attached to positions and offices open to all. That everyone has an equality of opportunity. Now the problem is, what does benefit everyone mean? Now we can think of, it seems like a straightforward phrase, but if we think about it, we can think that benefit everyone means that it has to benefit each person independently. So each person's well-being has to be increased. Or we might think that it benefits the average person's well-being, that on average, as long as everyone is better off on average, that means that it benefits everyone. Or we might think that it's something else. And Rawls' intuition is that it's something else. So his reasoning begins from a baseline of equality. And he says that this principle is so obvious that we would expect it to occur to anyone immediately. That if we're going to distribute, if we're going to have when we distribute social and economic goods, we should distribute these equally. Everyone gets the same amount. But he admits that and he thinks this is also obvious, that there are some inequalities that benefit everyone. We can easily think of having some economic inequalities, right, that allow for economic growth, right? If we reward entrepreneurs and inventors for taking risks in an economy, that boosts economic growth and it lifts everyone up, right? This idea. Or if we, reward people with higher incomes and higher social prestige, people who develop cures for viruses and cancer, people who develop new life-saving forms of medical technology or other forms of technology, or people, or media, novels, movies, entertainment. Culture, art, education, things that benefit everyone in society, that we might think that we might want to incentivize that type of creation by compensating those people with more income, right? Giving them more wealth. So we can have a system where we have inequalities, but everyone is better off, right? If we had inequality in a society, but no one was poor, I think we would probably all agree that would be better than a society where everyone is equal, but everyone is equally poor. So how do we choose which principles depart from this baseline of equality? Now he argues for a maximum principle, and this is what he's saying: is he's choosing for the design of a society in which his enemy is assigning him his place. So we're going to rank alternatives by their worst possible outcomes, and we're going to try to maximize the position. We're going to make sure that we're going to assume that we're going to be on the bottom end of the distribution, and we're going to maximize our well-being from the perspective of the bottom end. So this is an example he gives, and I'm going to work through a couple of examples to help us think through this, that when we're looking from three different distributions of circumstances, and we can think of these as basic utility, right? In distribution one, there's a risk that someone is really worse off, that you have -7 value welfare, but most people in the society are pretty well off. Similarly, in decision two, there's an even bigger spread, but if you're a person three here in distribution two, you're consistent here. And the difference here is with distribution three, where there's significantly less inequality, but in cases both person two and person three are worse off than they would be in other worlds, but person one is better off in this world. Now, if we're thinking of from the position of average utility, like is the average person made better off, we might choose distribution two or distribution one. We would kind of do the math right here. 20. This is 20 minus 7 is 14, so this is an average utility of 7. Oh no, sorry, 14 is an average utility of 4.5. This one, 21 minus 8 is 13, so we'd have an average utility of, a little bit lower, 4.2-ish. And here we have an average utility of, well, here this one doesn't quite work the way we want because the average utility is actually going to be higher. So ignore everything I just said. But let's look at a graph because that's going to be a better way to graph this. So we start from this baseline of equality that if we have wealth in quintiles, so this is the wealthiest 20%, the wealthiest 20%, and the poorest 20% here, and this is just wealth from $0 to a bajillion dollars, right? We start from this baseline of equality that everyone has the same wealth. Now we begin from this position of extreme inequality, and here it's pretty clear that we probably would not justify this from Rawls's maximum principle or even an average utility principle, right? Because on average, everyone is kind of worse off unless you're in this top quintile over here. Unless you are in the top 20% of wealth owners in the country, you're going to be worse off than in the position of equality. So pretty much no one would vote for this behind the veil of ignorance. Now the question comes with our next two distributions of wealth, orange and green. Now, what do you think Rawls would choose? Now, if we're looking from the position of the average person, we would probably choose green here, this green distribution that because if you think of like the number of people under this curve, it's much greater. Pretty much if you are in the middle class or the top two wealthiest quintiles of society, you are better off than in any other distribution. But if we're thinking from the perspective of the worst off, we're going to vote for this orange distribution because we're interested in this distance here. The distances between the worst off and the alternatives. So we're going to only look to the left of this terrible line here. We're going to look at if I'm in the bottom fifth of wealth owners in a society, which kind of principle, which kind of distribution am I going to be best off in? Because you're not worried about what the average person is. You're worried about getting the worst dealt the hand of cards because you don't know where you're going to end up, and so you're willing to sacrifice lower wins here, lower wins on this side, with fewer losses down here. So again, to summarize, the purple would be rejected by both maximin and average utility interpretations of the second principle. The green would be rejected by maximin, even though the average utility interpretation of the second principle would be acceptable. Only the orange would be accepted by the maximin, Rawls's interpretation, but rejected by average utility, because on average you're going to be better off in the green distribution. So we get this kind of summary that Rawls gives us, that first, we're going to have an equality in basic rights and duties, And the second principle, that social and economic inequalities are just if and only if they result in compensating benefits for everyone, and in particular for the least advantaged members of society. This is what's known as the difference principle, because we're trying to figure out how inequalities can be justified. So I'm going to quickly summarize some implications and critiques of this theory. We're going to be spending a long time thinking about critiques of this theory in the next couple of weeks. But some implications first, that this is a critique of utilitarianism. He's saying that we shouldn't evaluate whether a society is just from how well its people are on average, like what the average welfare of the citizen is, but from what the average welfare or from the root to how just a society is to how it treats the worst off, not the average. It also offers a very strong critique of desert or merit, that he's basically saying that none of us deserve any of the things that we have, because they can all be traced back to social and natural contingencies of our birth that we had no control over. And that we should design social institutions to basically eliminate those immorally arbitrary inequalities. He argues that justice should be focused around the question of distribution, and this has really shaped political philosophy since Rawls, that we tend to think now about justice in terms that Rawls himself set up. We don't think of justice in terms of like Plato's like overall societal structure or the kind of more communal aspects of Al-Farabi or Confucius. He also gives us a conception of the self and this is what's known as a thin conception of the self, that fundamentally what we are as people are not cultural creatures, we're not religious creatures, we don't have virtues or values, that we are ultimately just rational choosers, that we're kind of like calculating machines that are choosing what is going to be the best off for us. If you've taken microeconomics classes, you're very familiar with this conception of the self. Finally, we get this focus of fair procedures for Rawls. And this primacy of fair procedures, he explicitly kind of excludes questions of cultural difference or historical injustice. He doesn't actually care how we get to those distributions. He's just saying, historically, he's giving us a procedure by which we can fairly evaluate those distributions. Now, based on these implications, you can probably imagine some critiques. First, even on Rawls' own terms, would people actually reason this way behind the veil of ignorance? Why would people actually adopt this very risk-averse maximum strategy? Why wouldn't they roll the dice and try to maximize their benefit overall? Why wouldn't they be risk takers in the veil of ignorance? People also question whether or not his idea of rational self-interest is universal, or if this is culturally specific to Western market liberal democracies. Many also argue that the conception of the self as fundamentally a rational chooser is too thin, that by excluding things like our gender or racial identities, by excluding our cultural or religious backgrounds, by excluding our life plans and goals and our abilities, that we've actually taken away the things that make us distinct and unique and interesting humans and turned us into robots. Finally, on the kind of other side of the spectrum, and we'll see a similar argument here from Hayek next class, that we need things like merit and desert for society. That we need people to have a sense of responsibility for society. That we want to reward people who work hard, because that makes society better off in the long run. So that's it for today on Rawls. Next class, we're going to read from Friedrich Hayek, Hayek's Law Legislation of Liberty, Chapter 9. He calls it the mirage of social justice, and to think about what Hayek's critique of distributive justice is. So for the discussion thread for today, summarize Rawls's theory of justice in a few sentences. Then pick one contemporary political issue that you care about. How could Rawls's theory be applied? Would the current state of this issue, so like the current way that this is the resources are distributed with respect to this issue, meet the standards or requirements of Rawls's theory of justice? So that is what I'd like for you to think about over the course of this week. And that is going to wrap us up for our lesson on Rawls. Again, this is a very schematic and simplified version of Rawls. I'm happy to talk about the details of his theory and analysis in office hours or over email if that's something of interest to you. So I will see you all next week, next class, for the discussion of Hayek. As always, send me an email, drop into office hours if you have any questions, especially about your upcoming papers or about any of these readings. Hopefully this made sense. Let me know if there's things that can be made more clear, and I will see you next class.